In the riverside city of Urumba, Kelechi Nwoke wore success like a crown, while Amara wore quieter things: patience, prayer, and the kind of tenderness that survives long, dry seasons. Each month arrived like a verdict wrapped in white paper. Each month left them with the same silence. One Harmattan night, it split. 7 years, Kelechi said, loosening his silk tie as if it were a noose. 7 years of mother's questions and friends who toast me by day and laugh by night. How long must I answer whispers? He paced the marble like a caged man rehearsing to a mirror. Amara, sitting on the bed with fingers pressed together, kept her voice steady. "We have tried," she said. "Let us both see another doctor. Let us test together. Truth is lighter than guessing." He scoffed at together as if it were a small cup offered to a thirsty king. "You'd have me stand in a waiting room and surrender my name to pity? I am not an experiment." His voice climbed until it scraped the chandelier. He recited the ledger, the house, the cars, the contracts across 2 countries, and then named the item that refused to appear: a child. Amara lifted her gaze. "We vowed for better and for worse. This is a crossing. We can cross it if we walk together." Kelechi's laugh held ice. "Crossings are for those with time to waste. My peers christen sons while I host silence. I will not be a proverb." He took out his phone with the precision of approving a deal. "Draw the papers," he told his lawyer. "She leaves tomorrow." The call ended. The sentence remained like smoke. Amara rose, dignity holding what grief could not. She drew a small suitcase and folded dresses, each one a postcard from a life she had kept. A choir white for Easter, a blue Ankara from a rainy birthday, a plain cotton she wore when he was ill. She packed photos but left the frames, packed spices but left the brass jar from his aunt, packed her Bible and the pen that had underlined promises. At the door she turned. "One day you will understand," she said, "not as a curse, simply as weather." He glanced past her to his reflection and straightened his cuff. Night met her with wind that tasted of sand and sellers pulling down tarpaulins. She walked because walking was the only verb left. At Ifeoma's flat, questions waited behind a kettle already boiling. Ifeoma wrapped Amara in a soft cloth, led her to the couch and let silence do the first work. Later came tea, then careful words. "He threw me out," she said. "He called me a failure he needed to escape." Ifeoma hissed the kind that means a woman has heard enough foolishness for one lifetime. "And did he test?" she asked. Amara shook her head. "He said the problem is obvious." Night lingered. They ate a little, slept a little. Dawn made the room honest. Amara stared at the ceiling and counted the hairline cracks like paths on a map. Ifeoma brought bread and eggs and a rope of a question. "What will you do today?" Amara answered before fear could speak. "I will find out the truth." The clinic was a short ride away, a modest building with hibiscus at the windows, and a receptionist who believed in mornings. Forms asked private questions and promised private answers. Blood left her arm like small offerings. A scan rolled cool over her belly. Science, in patient handwriting, noted what it saw and did not see. When she stepped out into the sun, she felt less like something discarded and more like a person walking with signposts. In the evening, they spread the clinic card and bus receipts on the table like a small map. Ifeoma's voice turned practical, the balm of women who fixed chipped enamel and burnt stew without poems. "You will stay here," she said. "Tomorrow we speak of rent and work. Tonight we speak of breathing." Amara nodded. She washed her face, tied her scarf, and sat by the window where river air reached this street. She rehearsed no revenge and lit no fires in her mind. She folded her sorrow into a smaller square and slid it into a pocket where she could feel it, but it would not spill. By the time the muezzin called and the first buses groaned awake, she had chosen a quiet vow: to let truth, not humiliation, build the path ahead. Somewhere across town,
Kelechi practiced a smile in the mirror and mistook it for peace. Somewhere in this room, Amara practiced standing up and discovered that it felt like hope learning how to walk. Outside, the river kept moving, refusing to carry anyone's shame alone.
2 mornings after the tests, Amara and Ifeoma sat in Sunrise Women's Clinic beneath a framed hibiscus print while the wall clock ticked like a calm, insistent heart. And when Dr. Halima Adegoke entered with a soft smile and a file tucked against her chest, the room seemed to inhale and hold. She greeted them like old friends, sat and spoke with the measured gentleness of someone who has learned that truth can heal and also bruise. Your results are clear, Amara. Hormones balanced, tubes open, ovulation regular. There is nothing here that says your body cannot carry life. And the words fell first as clang, then as rain, then as water that found every parched crease inside Amara, who laughed and cried at once, because joy and anger often arrive as twins. But Halima, experienced in the choreography of relief, reached across and folded Amara's hands in hers, saying, "Let this report be a door, not a weapon. Fertility is a duet, and blame is a broken instrument." Then slid 2 copies over the desk with paper clips and a pen for notes, adding practical counsel about nutrition, rest, and the invitation, if ever invited, to encourage a partner to test without shame. Outside, Urumba's morning commerce carried on indifferent to epiphanies, keke horns and sellers' calls threading the street like bright ribbon. But inside Amara, something unclenched and stood up straighter, as if spine and soul recalled their proper shape. And she walked with Ifeoma to a roadside canteen where the tea is always too hot and the bread remembers yesterday's heat, and they ate in grateful silence until Ifeoma, who distrusts long pauses when there is work to do, tapped the table and asked, "What does freedom look like by Friday?" Not someday, not when, but by Friday. They went home to the small flat with peeled paint that looks like a continent, spread the clinic card, the receipts, and a ruled notebook on the table, and they began to draw a plan as though hope were a blueprint. A balcony food stand first, then a ground floor shop if God smiled, starting capital scraped from Ifeoma's savings jar, a second-hand warmer from her cousin Kamsi, a charcoal stove borrowed from a neighbor who sold puff-puff in the evenings, 2 iron pots to be found at Urumba Central Market, a plastic tablecloth, a chalkboard sign, and a name, because names are sails that catch wind. Ember Thyme, Amara said, tasting the sound, because embers mean warmth that endures when flames go quiet, and thyme means care you can smell before you see. And Ifeoma grinned, slapping the notebook as though it owed her money, and wrote the name in block letters so bold the page seemed to lean forward. The next day they threaded through the market's crush, where lamp wicks dangle like curious birds, and tomatoes stacked like red planets, and Ifeoma haggled the way good women pray, confident, rhythmic, certain the other side will yield, while Amara checked the bottoms of pots for wobble and the edges for thinness, chose one heavy and one heavier, bought onions by the sack and peppers wearing the warning color of small suns, collected a scuffed but faithful warmer, and, after a quick detour to Auntie Sade's fabric stall for a cheap table runner that would pretend to be expensive if you didn't look too long, they returned to the flat where the balcony waited like a stage. Amara cleaned until metal shone enough to see a determined face, toasted spices in a dry pan until the air smelled like memory, ground ginger with a stone that had listened to many mothers, and built a base stew so patiently layered that the room seemed to hum in agreement. And between stirring and tasting, she taped the clinic report inside the cupboard door, not as ammunition, but as a compass, and wrote the first small menu on the chalkboard. Jollof with backbone, pepper stew that tells the truth, beans that remember home. In the evening, they tested portions on neighbors who offered feedback like elders, declaring the rice proud in a good way and the stew honest,
and Ifeoma counted costs out loud, subtracting charcoal and tomatoes and salt, and the quiet cost of labor that women too often pretend is free, while Amara ran her thumb along the notebook's margin and imagined a cue that smelled like pepper, a bell above the door, a day when she would pay the rent without glancing at the ceiling for courage. Across town, in rooms with colder air, Kelechi approved floral mock-ups and repeated a toast about destiny to men who love mirrors, while a planner scribbled guest lists that would later carry a name he underlined without mercy. But in this apartment, the lamps burned modestly, and a different future took root. Amara set 3 clean bowls on the rack as if blessing a table she could not yet see, rolled her prayer shawl and laid it beside the window, and when the night breeze carried in river damp and far laughter, she whispered a vow not to let vindication become her faith, only work and gratitude and rest, because the body that the world called lacking had just proved itself whole, and the heart that had been discarded had picked up a pen and written a beginning. Sleep came shallow but kind, the kind that leaves energy behind when it leaves. And before dawn, she rose to soak beans, to slice onions with small forgiveness for their sting, to salt water like a promise, to set Ember and Thyme upon a balcony rail that would, by noon, hold elbows and conversation and the first sturdy coin of a new life. At first light on Monday, Ember and Thyme announced itself with the oldest marketing in the world, a smell that walked down the stairwell and tugged people by the sleeve, while Amara arranged 2 iron pots like twin hearths, and Ifeoma chalked a crooked menu that read as promise more than typography. The street answered with footfalls, a keke horn, and the soft clatter of coins leaving pockets. And by 7, the first customer, a tailor named Obina, with tape still draped around his neck, leaned on the balcony rail, inhaled deeply, and said the rice smelled like bold ideas, which made Amara laugh for the first time in days. She served him in warm scoops, practiced the price she had rehearsed, and tucked his compliment away where confidence grows. And then a woman with a baby tied to her back ordered beans and 2 extra spoons for older children still shepherding each other to school. And a bank teller in a crisp shirt asked for pepper stew that would wake him more than coffee. And Ember and Thyme, still more intention than business, began to breathe like something alive. The 4th customer of the morning was the man who would become a ritual, arriving in a white shirt rolled at the forearms with a clean laptop bag and a face that looked like he spent time listening to things other people missed. And he stood with his head slightly tilted as if calibrating the aroma, then smiled as though the smell had just told him a joke and said, "Do you recommend spicy or gentle?" To which Amara, remembering the line she had minted for courage, replied, "Spicy has more opinions," and he chose opinions without hesitation. He paid in exact notes, set them on the table instead of pressing them into her palm, and, because the line was beginning to coil, stepped aside to a wobbly plastic chair, eating with the quiet focus of a person who treats food like a conversation rather than a task. And when he finished, he returned the plate with thanks that sounded earned, not performed. He came again the next day, and the day after, and on Thursday he arrived with 2 colleagues from the engineering firm down the road who argued about aggregates while praising the stew. And by the end of the week, Ifeoma, who notices patterns the way birds notice wind, simply started portioning an extra plate at 7:45 because she could tell the rhythm of his footsteps on the stairs. His name, offered without ceremony as he handed over a new pack of serviettes he claimed were on sale, was Malik Danjuma, a civil engineer who sometimes arrived with the ghost of dust on his shoes and who listened when Amara talked about tomatoes as if she were explaining rivers and dams, asking practical questions like a man who enjoys understanding how good things happen. On a slow Tuesday, when rain kept the boldest customers close to their radios, Malik sat under the balcony's tin shade and told them about a bridge his team was rehabilitating, and the way the river insisted on shifting its bed each rainy season, and how he had learned to respect materials because arrogance makes structures fail. And when he said it, Amara let the sentence sit where she could find it later. He did not ask the kind of questions men often ask when they think kindness requires intrusion. And when he learned from gossip, rather than from Amara, that she had come to the balcony after a divorce, he did the rare, decent thing of pretending he had not heard, giving her the dignity of her own timing. He contributed small things that mattered: onions by the sack when the price surprised the market, a bag of charcoal when the supply truck stalled, bottled water on a hot Friday, and when he hovered too close to helpful, Ifoma would clap him away, saying, "Engineer, go and build roads. This kitchen has a governor," which always made him grin and step back without wounded pride. Amara, whose laughter had gone into hiding the night she left Kelechi's house, discovered it would still come out for terrible puns about time and time. And she noticed that Malik's jokes never positioned anyone as the fool except himself, which felt like safety. One afternoon, a tiny crisis arrived, like they always do, in the form of a snapped table leg and soup threatening to tilt toward catastrophe. And Malik, who was there collecting his usual portion of opinions, crouched, steadied the pot with his knee, and fished a multi-tool from his bag, anchoring a temporary brace while Ifoma slid a crate under the table. And later he returned with 2 fresh, varnished legs he'd turned in a colleague's workshop, installing them with the care of a man who understands that stability is an act of love. Business grew in humble steps, obvious regulars, new faces following old noses, a habit of people returning to say the food tasted like remembering, and by month end, Ember Thyme could pay rent without making the curtain sigh, and Amara could sleep knowing tomorrow had fuel. On evenings, Malik lingered, conversation stretched without interrogations, how pepper behaves when disrespected, why bridges need expansion joints, the efficiency of lists and the mercy of naps. And when he finally asked, under the amber light of a market bulb, if she would join him for coffee at a place with chairs that don't wobble, she felt 2 impulses wrestle inside her: the reflex to stay safe and the truth that safety had begun to look like stagnation. And she surprised herself by saying yes, while Ifoma, pretending to rearrange spoons, mouthed a silent hallelujah to the window. Coffee did not become confession. It became ease, sips, street watching, engineers' stories of mishaps with comic endings, Amara's recipes with histories tucked inside, an agreement that grief deserves chairs but not thrones. And when they parted, Malik said, "No rush, only returns," a sentence that felt like good architecture, and he kept it, returning at a pace that honored her work and her healing. Across town, Kelechi approved a sample of orchids and practiced a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and a planner slid a guest list across a table with a name underlined so sharply the paper almost tore. But on the balcony that would soon become a shop, 3 clean plates dried on a rack. Steam climbed into evening like a grateful prayer, and Amara felt the improbable, ordinary miracle of a day that had paid for itself and left a little extra, the kind of margin where trust can begin again.
They married without spectacle, a morning ceremony where the pastor's voice sounded like a good broom, simple, useful, clearing the way, and afterward they ate puff-puff and laughed when the sugar found corners of Malik's beard, and Ifeoma danced in the narrow courtyard as if the ground itself were a drum. It was not a victory parade. It was 2 people signing up to carry each other's ordinary, and that is heavier and holier than fireworks. And in the weeks that followed, they practiced the small choreography of permanence, Malik waking before dawn to tighten a loose hinge and kiss Amara's forehead, Amara labeling spice jars and leaving him notes that said, "Water the basil, not the broom." Both of them pushing Ember and Thyme from balcony to street level with a rented storefront whose window glass held more hope than reflection. They painted the wall the color of ripe plantain, hung a bell that preferred to ring twice, and wrote a menu that changed with tomatoes and mood. And customers came as if they'd been waiting at the curb for the move all along, slipping into rattan chairs, tapping phones, telling friends that the stew here tasted like someone had apologized to the pepper before using it. Malik watched the till without counting his ego in it, carried sacks without narrating his sacrifice. And when Amara's shoulders rose toward her ears at the sight of a long queue, he took his place at the sink and washed plates with the rhythm of a metronome, because help is a verb, not a speech. And on Sundays, they closed it too and walked by the river, where he told her about bridges that need room to expand or else summer heat snaps them, and she tucked that into her chest with the rest of her new rules for not breaking. Then one morning, the stew smelled metallic. Onions made a sharper argument than usual, and the floor moved half a whisper farther away. Amara blamed the long week, drank water, and told herself to sleep earlier, but the feeling followed her like a polite shadow, and when bread tasted like a coin, she agreed to the clinic not because she believed, but because Malik's concern arrived without pressure. The nurse at sunrise smiled like a secret and returned with a result that said future in block letters, and Amara sat very still while the room filled with a sound that was hers but not hers. Laughter tangled with tears, relief flushing a basement she hadn't admitted existed. And Malik said thank you to a God he'd been arguing with since the day grief put a dent in his life. Then he pressed his forehead to her hand like a man greeting a holy door. Weeks later, during a scan, Dr. Halima narrowed her eyes, changed the angle, narrowed them again, and then smiled a smile that seemed too wide for the room. "I am hearing 3, she said, and the sentence hung in the air like a chandelier someone had been threatening to install since chapter 1. 3 heartbeats, 3 tiny rebellions against the old story. And Malik laughed the laugh he reserves for miracles and chaos, the kind that suggests he is not afraid of either. They prepared like people who have learned that joy and logistics drink from the same cup. Efioma measured a window for curtains that could survive jam-handed inspectors, neighbors brought lists and advice, and Auntie arrived with proverbs that worked on babies and on adults who think they're smarter than babies. Malik built the cradle with 3 shallow hollows and sanded it until it felt like a promise. And Amara folded small clothes until her hands remembered the movements without looking, stopping sometimes to press the cotton to her face because softness can be a medicine. Business adjusted its breathing to theirs, regular stacking plates and wiping tables, a teenager learning the register, a chalkboard announcing shorter hours with a flourish that tried and failed to hide practicality. And at night, Amara talked to the belly in the quiet voice she used for stubborn beans, telling stories about soup and rivers, about how people can say the wrong thing when they are frightened, and how forgiveness is a kind of engineering too. Fear visited, but did not move in. She let it stand on the veranda like a courier waiting for a signature and then sent it away, because what is unfolding required room, and room is made by refusing to furnish it with panic. And when the Saturday came with a sky the color of wet slate, the contractions announced themselves like magnified heartbeat, and they went to the clinic under a rain that made the city sound honest. And labor did not romanticize itself. It asked for courage and breath and the ability to go forward one counted second at a time. And Amara discovered that her body, accused by a whole chorus of ignorance in a previous chapter, knew exactly how to push a new chorus into the world. First son angry enough to be healthy, second son indignant in a different key, third son arriving like a punchline everyone needed, and Malik laughed the laugh he reserves for miracles and chaos, the kind that suggests he is not afraid of either. Word traveled by mouth faster than any network. Amara of Ember and Thyme, 3 boys, and blessings arrived wrapped in plastic bowls and loud advice. And while visitors debated whose nose belonged to which child, Amara lay there with the kind of tired that glows, holding a truth she would never again file away in a cupboard. She was never broken, and even if she had been, broken things still hold light when someone loves them with patience. When they brought the boys home, the bell over the shop door rang and rang like church. The rattan chairs filled with faces that needed to see proof more than they needed seats. Efioma cried into a dish towel and then scolded the bell for not respecting nap time. And that night, between feedings and the soft conspiracies of swaddles, Malik whispered, "We are a home." And Amara, half asleep, said, "We have always been. We just grew louder." And out on Wharf Road, the rain washed the city clean, enough to try again tomorrow.
Kelechi met Zara at a rooftop lounge where the city glittered like an argument won too easily, and she introduced herself with the kind of handshake that made men recalibrate. She was a fashion buyer who could price a dress at 20 paces, and a daughter who had taught herself not to apologize for wanting good things. And Kelechi, who loved anything that could be mistaken for inevitability, decided she was a sign. Their first dinner was efficient. She asked about his work and listened like an auditor. He asked about her travels and listened like a man timing a pitch. And by dessert, the outline of a future had been sketched in the air between them. Neat lines, clean corners, no smudges. He liked that she did not gush, and she liked that he did not brag. Or rather, that he had learned to brag in a register that sounded like strategy. And within weeks, they were seen at the kinds of gatherings where people notice watches and forget names, where Kelechi's laughter slid across marble floors and Zara's silhouette carved silence from music. Mama Nwoke, who measured worth in grandchildren and land titles, approved with unusual speed and said, in the tone of a prayer disguised as advice, that Zara looked like a woman who could build a house that holds sons. And Kelechi, already rehearsing toasts for a reception he had not booked, felt pride roll through him like summer heat. Zara, who lived by calendars, added a new one with the word soon circled in 3 colors, then added a question only she could read. What does love require beyond spectacle? When she suggested premarital health checks during a quiet evening, her voice light, her body angled toward diplomacy, Kelechi's smile thinned, and the room lost a degree. She framed it as prudence, 2 people caring for the machine they meant to drive for decades. But he heard only insult humming under the hood, the ghost of a chapter he refused to reopen, and replied, too quickly, that faith and focus were better tests than clinics, that we will not borrow trouble, that my house does not host doubt. Zara filed that under things to watch, even as she said okay for the sake of the evening. The wedding planning moved like a convoy with sirens. Halls toured, florists auditioned, lighting designers pitched a twilight that would make everyone look forgiven, while Kelechi negotiated rates with the ruthlessness he reserved for contracts and the tenderness he reserved for his reflection. And he started to hear in his head an applause he had not yet earned. The guest list metastasized, governor's aides, men who call each other chairmen in restaurants, cousins who consider proximity a career, and then, late at night when the planner's pen paused for breath, he added a name and underlined it, Amara, writing it as if the ink could bruise. He told himself it was closure, a final ledger entry where he would prove without speaking that life had upgraded him, that whatever softness had once paused him at their kitchen door had been replaced by a shine no one could doubt. The invitation courier delivered satin envelopes across the city, and influencers rehearsed captions with emojis, and Kelechi tried on a white agbada in a mirror that had learned not to argue, while Zara tasted cakes and practiced smiles, and alone at her vanity pressed 2 fingers to her lower belly as if listening for a headline. Days turned into fittings and fittings into rehearsals, and Zara realized that every time someone mentioned children, Kelechi's jaw did something small and stubborn, like a door that almost closes. And she placed that observation beside the unshared test kits in her drawer, whose pale windows still spell wait. She prayed a prayer that was half whisper and half inventory, asking that if love needed a bridge, she would know how to build one without pretending the river wasn't there. Kelechi, meanwhile, curated the symbolism with the zeal of a museum keeper. A band from Accra, because excellence should arrive from elsewhere. Orchids heavy enough to prove a point.
a drone shot that would begin on the lagoon and end on his smile, and a seating plan that placed Amara in the front row, because Grace, he told himself, deserves a good view of victory. When Connell, his oldest friend, asked whether this was wise, Kelechi laughed the way men laugh when the right question finds them too soon, and said the past deserves to witness the present. And anyway, what is a story without an audience? Zara tried once more, a few nights before the final menu tasting, to fold in the suggestion of a simple joint checkup for both of us, just to be sure we start on a ground that does not shift. And Kelechi, smoothing his cuff as if ironing the moment, replied with a parable about seeds that thrive under faith, not microscopes. She let it go because the parry to peace sometimes requires you to pack light, but her eyes, when he looked away, wrote a note to her future self. Ask again later, if later exists. Invitations became RSVP screenshots. Fabric became dresses worn by women who choreographed their entrance in group chats. And the city, which loves a spectacle it can either praise or punish, began to hum with expectation. Kelechi timed his workouts and curated his skincare and told the planner to rehearse the lighting cues until the hall could blush on command. In the quiet interludes, when even ambition needs water, he pictured Amara in the crowd, not weeping, just watching, and felt something complicated flicker in his chest, quickly labeled it triumph, and turned the flicker into fuel. He did not wonder how truth prefers to arrive. He did not ask the river what it remembers. He simply pressed send on one last message to the planner. Confirm again, front row for Amara Nuadinma. Make sure her card is printed in full gold.
Urumba woke to a wedding day that behaved like a festival. Traffic moving in cooperative waves, vendors selling cold drinks as if they were tickets, radio hosts rehearsing superlatives, and by mid-afternoon, the waterfront hall had gathered its spectacle. Orchids draped like snowfall, a string quartet testing scales that made chandeliers seem to breathe, ushers in matching asoke guiding senators and stylists to chairs that shone with too much polish. Kelechi stood at the altar in white agbada and a groom's certainty, touching the cuff of his sleeve the way a pilot touches instruments, checking, rechecking, convincing himself that the sky will obey. Guests performed the polite theater of arrivals. The band polished its brass in the wings. The videographer fluttered a drone in an arc that began on the lagoon and promised to end on Kelechi's curated smile. And somewhere in the anteroom, Zara's bridesmaids pinned veils and rehearsed the aisle with whispers as soft as starch, while Zara herself looked at her reflection and decided to believe that love could be built like a well-planned wardrobe, pieces selected with intention, worn with care, repaired when necessary. Then the air at the entrance shifted the way a room shifts when the truth enters it, quietly at first, like a rumor that hasn't learned to speak, because the black Rolls-Royce whispered to a halt at the carpet's lip, and the driver in gloves opened the door as if revealing an exhibit. And Amara stepped out in saffron that behaved like sunlight, not the loud, boastful kind, but the steady morning kind that finds flaws and makes them honest. She did not hurry, did not hesitate. She adjusted the bow tie of the smallest boy, took the middle one's hand, nodded at the eldest as if he were her co-captain, and together they moved with that unmistakable choreography of a family that has practiced getting across thresholds without losing anyone. Phones rose instinctively, not from malice, but from the modern reflex to collect proof. And even the quartet misplaced a note as the ushers recalculated routes in their heads. Whispers ran like water down tiled aisles. Is that her? Is that Amara? Are they hers? And the murmurs rang against the orchids until the flowers looked like they were eavesdropping. Amara's face carried the stillness of a lake that has learned to keep its weather in its pocket, and the boys, starched and curious, took in the room with the sacred unseriousness of children who have yet to learn that rooms can be cruel. At the front, Kelechi felt his rehearsal collapse inside his chest, a sudden disobedience of breath, because he had scripted this moment in a different key. He had ordered a chair in the front row with her name embossed in gold to stage his closure, to let Mercy sit witness to his upgrade, not to host a revelation that would pry open every sentence he had used to protect himself. His friend Colonel, posted at his right like a lighthouse, murmured something that meant breathe, but also meant brace, and Kelechi did both poorly. The pastor, a careful man who could land a ceremony in any weather, looked down at his program as if the paper might provide emergency liturgy for what was happening. The hall, once noisy with the safe arrogance of celebration, lowered its voice in a single shared exhale as Amara reached the section where the card with her name waited, exactly where he had ordered it, and she sat with the easy poise of someone who does not need permission to occupy her own history, settling the boys one to a side and one on her lap, smoothing a cowlick, pointing at the program with a finger that smelled faintly of thyme. Near the door, a former, in a dress the color of river clay, stood just inside the threshold, ready to be wall or wind as needed, and offered Amara a nod that traveled the distance like a hand on the shoulder. The quartet found its place again, and the organ's first chord rose brave and useful, and then Zara's procession began. Ushers straightening like punctuation, doors breathing open, veil lowering the world to gauze. Her steps measured, her smile present but not careless, her mind catching at the edges of the room's altered gravity before her eyes named the cause. She reached the midpoint, and through veil saw saffron like a sunrise placed in a pew, saw 3 small crowns of hair like commas in a sentence that had been rewritten, saw Kelechi's posture flicker, a minor electricity under linen, and she understood in a language older than words that something unrehearsed was now the main event. Still she moved, because momentum is also a vow, and she arrived at the altar where the pastor, who had weathered power outages and late bouquets and grooms who fainted under ambition, cleared his throat with the authority of a man who believes in beginnings, even messy ones, and invited the congregation to stand. They stood, all of them, not in agreement, but in reflex, and the hall became a theater of suspended intentions, a mother clutching a clutch, a senator calculating PR, an auntie praying into fabric, a photographer deciding whether the story was mercy or consequence. Amara kept her gaze soft, not evasive, and when one of the boys leaned forward to see the bow on Zara's bouquet, she whispered something that sounded like kindness and instruction folded together. Kelechi felt the weight of 2 timelines sitting on his shoulders like mismatched epaulets, the one he had curated for the city and the one he had denied in the kitchen at midnight, and the skin at his temples pulsed with the knowledge that stories have their own engines. Outside, the lagoon kept doing what water does, pretending not to notice human theater, and the drone made a wide circle, as if hunting for a frame big enough to hold dignity, error, and revelation at once. Inside, Zara's heartbeat negotiated with the organ's tempo, while the pastor's blessing gathered itself for takeoff. And in that stretched second before language resumed, the room reached a fragile equilibrium. Saffron and white, past and present, proof and plan, all arranged like a problem set a city would spend the evening solving in salons and group chats. Amara, who had not come to win but to be seen without explanation, rested her palm on her son's knee, inhaled and exhaled. Kelechi swallowed a truth that tasted like metal and mercy. Zara lifted her chin because grace is a posture before it is a speech, and the ceremony, still convinced it could proceed, hovered on the brink of saying its first official word.
The pastor lifted his hands for quiet, and the hall obliged, but obedience could not mend the torn fabric of attention, and before he could string the first blessing, Zara tilted her head toward Kelechi and whispered through gauze, "Who is she?" Not theatrical, simply surgical. Kelechi's mouth shaped a name that left his lips slowly, Amara, and the word, small as it was, collapsed 1,000 rehearsals. Zara's gaze moved to the boys, 3 small facts in tiny shoes, then back to Kelechi's eyes where evasion flickered like bad electricity. And in the kind of decision that keeps women from drowning in other people's narratives, she took one deliberate step forward so the microphone caught her, soft, steady, unshakably courteous, and asked, "Did you tell me she could not bear children?" The room drew breath the way an ocean withdraws before a wave. Kelechi reached for a different timeline and found only air. "We should speak after," he said, voice low. "We will speak where the story was staged," Zara replied, then turned, without malice, without performance, toward the saffron quiet in the front row. "Madam, please forgive the intrusion in your mourning. Are those your children?" Amara rose with one son in the curve of her arm, the other two secured by a glance, and answered in the register she now reserved for truth, even when it shook, "Yes." A hush traveled the hall. Not shock alone, but an accounting, the sound a city makes when math corrects a rumor. And the pastor, who had learned to read storms, closed his book, because liturgy cannot bless what isn't ready. Kelechi's tongue searched for a sentence that could carry both pride and repentance, and found neither. He faced the congregation and discovered that public was a mirror without flattery. "I believed," he began, but the verb betrayed him, and Zara, who refused to be cast as either villain or volunteer in someone else's cover story, placed her bouquet gently on the step like a fragile instrument, and said, "Then I withdraw." The words were not shouted, they were placed, and because dignity has its own acoustics, they reached the last row. Bridesmaid, startled into motion, reached for her veil. She lifted it herself, spine long, mouth calm, and took Kelechi's hands only long enough to return them to him, palms facing him, so he could see what was his to hold from now on. "May you find the courage to tell the truth before rooms have to do it for you," she said, not unkind, and then to Amara with a nod that meant, "I see you. Congratulations, your peace enters before you." She turned and began the walk back down the aisle that invitations had imagined in the other direction. Phones, which had been raised like shields against uncertainty, sank a little, as if reminded that mercy is more beautiful than spectacle. And even the quartet, reaching for something to play, found only silence worth keeping. Kelechi took 2 steps after her and stopped. Connell's hand on his sleeve was not a restraint, but a reminder. Some chases are really attempts to postpone learning. He faced the room again, and for the first time in years, allowed the shape of sorry to form without negotiation. "I was proud," he said, "and I built a story that made my pride look like wisdom. I am sorry." The sentence did not repair the day, it repaired his mouth. Near the door, Ifeoma let out a breath she had been saving for months, and with a small gesture only Amara could read, asked, "Stay or go?" Amara looked at her sons, then at the orchids, then at the man who had finally found the right noun, and answered with motion. She gathered the boys, fixed a bow tie that had revolted, and stood. No flouncing, no triumph. She had not come to topple anything. She had come to stand unbent inside her own name. As she turned toward the aisle, the guests did a human thing done too rarely. They made space. A senator stepped aside without checking who was watching. An auntie crossed herself and smiled. A blogger lowered her camera and used her eyes instead. Zara paused mid-aisle to let them pass, and when the women drew level, they exchanged a single look that said more than comment sections could hold. A recognition of costly clarity. Outside, the rolls waited like a held breath. Inside, the pastor, recovering his tools, invited anyone who wished to pray to do so in their heart, because words were loud and hearts, for once, were listening. By the time Amara reached the door, the drone, which had been wandering like a lost thought, dipped respectfully and cut its rotors. The river wind slipped in, rearranged a few strands of saffron, and the hall exhaled. In the foyer, Connell intercepted Kelechi's next impulse with a sentence that saved him from another mistake. Go later, not now. Go human, not public. Amara stepped into daylight where horns argued, and Ifeoma's laugh, relieved and fierce, bubbled up as she opened a car. One son asked if weddings always had this much staring, and Amara kissed his forehead and said, "Only when truth is late," which made Ifeoma clap once in agreement. The door closed, the rolls rolled, and Urumba began to do what cities do to shocking things: name them, post them, turn them into parables for cousins and cautions for sons. While in a hall full of orchids and undone plans, Kelechi lowered himself onto a chair that felt suddenly heavier and understood, with an ache that reached bone, that the ceremony he needed could not happen in public. It would be the slow work of telling the actual story, starting with himself and letting other people's dignity cost him something.
The first aftershocks arrived before the orchids were cleared, short, bright clips that escaped the hall and multiplied on phones, captions choosing sides, hashtags inventing shorthand for a day that would be retold at dinner, truth in saffron, wedding that wasn't, dignity walked, while inside the emptied aisle a planner counted centerpieces like prayer beads, and vendors negotiated what partial payment meant when a ceremony had detonated at the opening hymn. Canal walked Kelechi past the loading dock, where waiters smoked in disbelief and said, "Home first, noise later." And Kelechi obeyed, because the shape of his pride had finally cracked enough to let instruction in. In the car, he watched as 1,000 unfamiliar profiles told a story he used to control. Sponsors texted, "Let's pause till Monday," and an aide forwarded a thread where his name had become a cautionary proverb. And it was in that moving darkness, with the drone footage already re-edited by strangers, that he did the plainest brave thing he had done in years. He opened his calendar and booked an appointment with a urologist he had avoided by calling himself busy. The clinic was smaller than his office and gentler, its waiting room humming with the unremarkable heroism of people willing to know. And Dr. Chigozie Kalu asked simple questions, ordered tests with the neutrality of science, and did not permit shame to masquerade as sophistication. The report returned 2 days later with words Kelechi had refused to learn: oligospermia, asthenosospermia, low count, poor motility, likely sequel of an untreated infection from years ago, and the kind of late-night bravado men congratulate each other for surviving. And the doctor outlined treatment like a map: antibiotics, time, fewer bottles and more sleep, patience, perhaps procedures one day if marriage and desire ever shared a room with honesty again. And he said a sentence that refused to leave Kelechi's chest: humility is part of adherence. Outside sunlight made no commentary, but Kelechi did something he had practiced in the mirror and never meant. He wept, not performatively, just a clean leak of pressure. That evening, he told Mama Nwoke the whole truth, without editing for comfort, and she listened with the grief of a woman who realized her advocacy had become a weapon in the wrong war. "Go and apologize," she said, wiping her face with the edge of a wrapper, "and do it without a camera." And for once he did not argue that optics were also reality. The next morning, before the restaurant gate was fully rolled up, he stood outside Ember Thyme as if the bell were an exam, hat in hand, the city already buzzing with parables that used his name for punctuation. Ifeoma answered first, arms folded, gaze assessing, then stepped aside because gatekeeping was not the shape of her victory. Inside, a radio murmured high life, a pot made its gentle threats, and Amara looked up from onions with a calm that did not need an audience. Kelechi removed his cap and let his apology be short and unadorned. He had accused rather than tested, performed rather than partnered, loved status more than truth, and he had harmed her in rooms public and private. He named what the doctor named, not to beg pity, but to subtract the lie from the air between them. Amara listened the way a woman listens when she has nothing to prove and everything to protect. And when he finished, she wiped her hands, nodded once, and drew a border in sentences meant to bless and to guard. "I forgave you before today because I needed my hands free. I do not owe you friendship. Tell the truth to the people you taught the lie. Treat your body and your habits. Apologize to your mother and to the women whose mourning you're shattered. Do not come here to practice guilt. We are well." He asked, mouth near breaking, if he could greet the boys.
and she allowed a small wave from across the room where they staged an invasion of wooden spoons, and one boy saluted gravely as if acknowledging a ship that would not dock. He whispered thank you like a man being spared an unnecessary humiliation, and left with nothing in his hands, which felt like the right inventory. Across town, Zara wrote 2 notes, one to vendors, crisp with courtesy and compensation, one to the public, a single paragraph that refused spectacle. She had chosen peace, wished everyone well, and would be taking time with her people. No subtext, no arrows, just a door closing softly. The city tried to bait her into performance, and she would not come outside. By weekend, Kelechi's office felt different, the interns quieter, the chandelier a touch too bright, a meeting canceled to revisit alignment, and he told his team he would be off camera for a while, then called Dr. Kalu to ask for a therapist because medicine had cured other things but not the habit of arranging a world where he was always right. On Sunday, he sat in the back row of church not hoping to be seen, and let a prayer about truth be a sentence he did not edit. Monday brought a text from Canel, proud of the human, ignore the headlines, and a message from Mama Nwoke, a photo of cassava ridges behind her house, and the caption, "I'm planting what I can fix." And as Urumba processed its favorite new moral by exaggeration and meme, Amara stirred a pot that had nothing to prove, wiped a counter, and smiled at Malik arriving with 3 tiny aprons. The bell over the door rang twice like always, and the day, uninterested in drama, proceeded, which in itself felt like a miracle.
Recovery did not arrive as a trumpet, but as a calendar. Boxes Kelechi filled with ordinary acts that felt like penance and like beginning. Therapy on Tuesdays, where he learned to answer questions without performing. Clinic check-ins on Thursdays, where Dr. Kalu measured progress in patient, unflattering numbers. And a new practice each morning of naming 3 things he could not control and 1 thing he could. He told the truth in widening circles, first to the men who had once clapped for his swagger, then to partners who preferred silence, and he learned that apologies are payments made in installments, not a receipt you wave to close the shop. And when a junior staffer asked timidly if the company would still sponsor the university debate, he surprised himself by saying yes, and also by attending in the back row without a microphone, letting bright, nervous voices fill a room that used to hold only his. On Saturdays, he met a small group in the community center. Teachers, artisans, 2 taxi drivers, an imam with a laugh like a bell. And they spoke about the kind of manhood that turns fear into accusation, about testing before blaming, about what it means to be safe people in houses that hear everything. And Kelechi listened more than he talked, owning what he had done without turning confession into a stage, sometimes staying behind to stack chairs because humility needs muscles or it evaporates. Mama Nwoke weeded her cassava ridges and sent him videos of rain on tin roofs with captions that read like riddles. If it is the roof that leaks, why did you blame the floor? And he answered with small reports. Antibiotics finished. Sleep returned. A meeting declined because ego was hungry. Tiny proofs that sincerity had begun to survive past the first week. He wrote a letter to Zara he did not deliver, then wrote one he did, brief and clean, no grand gestures, only gratitude for her clarity and compensation receipts for vendors who had been stranded by his collapse. And she replied with the kind of mercy that keeps its shoes on, wishing him well, declining coffee, protecting the peace she had chosen like a garden. Across town, Ember and Thyme learned to walk with 3 small shadows. Amara and Malik rotated night duty with a choreography that included lullabies off-key and jokes whispered over steaming pots. Ifeoma arrived at dawn with a sling for whichever twin had declared himself supervisor,
and 2 aunties from the church took the lunchtime rush like a military operation, sliding plates with the precision of parade, while regulars became a village in the ways that matter. The tailor Obina fixing a torn awning, the bank teller bringing a spare fan when the afternoon heat turned the air thick, the woman with a baby on her back swapping recipes with Amara and returning later with mangoes for the boys who will one day eat everything. Business nudged from comfortable to steady, a small loan repaid early, a new sign painted by a teenager who insisted on being paid in both money and stew, and a mentorship circle formed on Thursdays where Amara taught 5 women costings and courage, how to say no to rudeness without losing the sale, how to price labor that the world assumes is free, while Malik drew diagrams on a torn cardboard explaining why you leave room in structures and in days for expansion and heat. Fear still visited sometimes, usually at night when the house fell quiet enough to hear old sentences, but Amara had learned to greet it like a distant relative who doesn't get to stay. And when she felt her chest tighten, she would stand at the window, smell the city's mixed stew of diesel and rain, and remember that truth had walked into a hall and sat down. One afternoon, a courier brought a thick envelope addressed in a handwriting she recognized as someone trying to be careful. Inside, a letter from Kelechi describing treatment, therapy, and a commitment to tell his circle the whole story, with a final line that simply wished her joy, and she folded it and placed it in a drawer that held warranties and birth certificates, not as a relic to polish, but as paper that said a page had turned. The triplets grew like sentences lengthening. One boy obsessed with lids he beat like drums, one with ants he followed as if they were parades, one with numbers he stacked in serious towers, and all 3 with the bell above the door, which they rang thrice whenever Ifeoma forgot to scold them. Sundays, after church and before naps, the family walked by the river, and Malik asked questions that were also blessings. What did we learn this week? Where did we choose peace? And Amara answered with measured honesty that rest is not theft, that boundaries are kindness wearing boots, that joy requires maintenance like any good machine. Urumba, which had been loud with the weddings lesson, moved on the way cities do, but kept a proverb or 2. Test before you accuse showed up on a tailor's wall. Tell the truth before the room does in a salon's mirror. And every so often, someone would stop by the shop and order stew and carefully thank Amara for breathing easier by watching her walk. In his office, Kelechi shifted his company's philanthropy toward a free clinic day, run quietly through Dr. Kalu's network. No logos, no speeches, only screens and nurses and men who left with numbers instead of rumors. And he stood at the back and greeted no one, which felt correct. He drafted a talk he nicknamed Failures That Taught Me How to Build, and then, to his credit, did not take it to a stage, choosing instead to carry it in conversations where awkwardness lived, with peers who still traded bravado like currency, and with a cousin who repeated the word barren as if it were a joke, until Kelechi said, gently and firmly, "We don't say that here anymore." Late one evening, passing Wharf Road, he slowed by Ember Thyme and saw through the window a life he could finally look at without wanting to edit. A man rinsing bowls, a woman laughing at something small, 3 small shadows inventing a game with wooden spoons. And he drove on, not with a hole in his chest, but with a map in his pocket. Fewer proclamations, more repairs. Fewer mirrors, more windows. And the knowledge that the future does not accept IOUs from pride, only today's honest work paid in full.
A year turned on Urumba's calendar the way Harmattan turns on the river, quietly at first, then with a clarity that makes edges honest. And the city remembered the wedding that wasn't as one of those hot afternoons when everyone learned a proverb at once. but memory softened around it, keeping the lesson and releasing the gossip. Ember and Thyme marked 12 months on the ground floor with a small celebration that smelled like pepper and orange peel. Not a grand reopening, just a thank you day where Amara wrote 4 neighbors on the chalkboard and priced bowls like a wink. Malik strung a line of paper fish across the doorway because the triplets insisted decorations must look like they can swim, and Ifeoma set out cups with the ferocity of a general who had conquered mornings. The mentorship circle had grown from 5 women to 9, and that afternoon they arrived in aprons carrying notebooks and questions, taking seats as if each chair were a stake in the ground. How to cost soups that require patience, what to pay a cousin who becomes half employee, half hurricane, how to refuse a rude customer without losing the room. And Amara answered in the tidy math she had learned by surviving. Pay yourself first in time, then in money. List your ingredients and include your back. No is a complete sentence you can season with kindness. Malik, who had become the chalkboard's quiet uncle, drew a bridge with gaps he labeled expansion and heat, reminding them to leave room for success and failure, or else the structure panics and cracks. And when the triplets clapped at the picture, he bowed as if they were a difficult parliament he'd just persuaded. Business had found its pace. Rent on time, a small cushion in an envelope with Ifeoma's signature, a farmer's van that brought tomatoes on credit because the driver trusted their word, a new bell with a softer dignity because the old one startled babies, and as if to affirm that ordinary is holy, a local paper gave Ember and Thyme a small square on page 3 titled Places That Taste Like Home, which made the aunties at church beam like co-authors. Across town, Kelechi's calendar had fewer speeches and more verbs. He still ran a company, but he also carried water for a clinic day Dr. Kalu organized each quarter, paying for tests that brought men into rooms they had been raised to avoid. And he stood at the back and wrote checks without logos, which turned out to be the easiest way to breathe. At the community center, he kept stacking chairs on Saturdays and learned to facilitate without treating the circle like a boardroom. And when a young man, eyes hot with shame, whispered that his new wife had not conceived and his mother had already started the old chorus, Kelechi handed him a slip with 2 names, 1 doctor, 1 therapist, and said, "Start here. If you love her, you'll learn what truth costs." Then walked the man to the door without turning the moment into a photograph. Mama Nwoke's cassava rose tall enough to shade regret, and she visited Ember and Thyme one market day, bearing a basket and a sentence that surprised her own mouth. "Daughter, may I buy soup?" And Amara, who had rehearsed that meeting in 100 kinder versions than she had once believed herself capable of, smiled and said, "Mama, please sit," ladled stew and asked after her joints. They spoke about weather, prices, how shame injures the old as much as the young, and when Mama left, she pressed Amara's hand in both of hers, a gesture that looked like apology and felt like blessing. Zara, whose name the city had tried to fold into the scandal, was living the next chapter with the stubborn privacy she cultivated, traveling to markets where fabric speaks first, launching a modest line whose seams were cleaner than the internet, and once, only once, she walked past Ember and Thyme, saw a saffron cloth in the window used as a runner, and smiled the kind of smile that knows it survived its own test. That evening, after the last thank you bowl went out, the family walked to the riverside where fishermen cast nets with the patience of people who have made peace with likely and unlikely outcomes. The triplets argued about who would be a doctor, a drummer, an ant scientist, then compromised on being brothers, which is a vocation big enough for 3. And Ifeoma, who never misses a chance to narrate life into sense, pointed at the water and said, "Look how it keeps moving. No posture, only flow." And Amara tucked the sentence in the same pocket where she keeps Dr. Halima's old report and her first day's till. They sat on a low wall eating oranges peeled into spirals, listening to gulls, while Malik asked their ritual questions. What did we learn this month? Where did we tell the truth quickly? Where did we rest without apology? And Amara answered like a ledger of grace,
that she learned to say yes to help before her back shouts, that she told a supplier no thank you to a shortcut that tasted like later trouble, that she lay on the floor with her sons and let dishes wait, because joy will not invoice you twice. The boys held up sticky hands for inspection, and judgment was withheld, which felt like an altar. A taxi idled nearby, and Kelechi stepped out with Connell, not to intrude, but to watch the water the way men do when they need something older than them. And he saw the family without the old heat, no need to edit, no need to reshoot. And he lifted a small, untheatrical hand. Amara returned the nod the way you nod at weather that has finally learned its season. Nobody crossed the distance, because not every closure is a conversation. Some are a hallway you walk through and leave unlit. Night arrived with the usual promises: breezes from the lagoon, the grit of sand in sandals, a city exhaling. And they all walked home. Kelechi to a house that fit him better now that the mirrors were fewer, Amara to a shop that would open tomorrow like prayer, Malik counting the boys softly like inventory he never wants to lose, and Ifeoma carrying leftover oranges and gossip she would convert into recipes. And when the bell over Ember Thyme rang twice the next morning, Urumba did what it had learned to do: test before it accused, bless what it could, let people grow. And the story that began with a slammed door and a sentence shaped like exile rested at last inside a quieter truth, that dignity, once reclaimed, is a room you can furnish with work, tenderness, and chairs enough for the people who stayed, the people who arrived, and even the people who finally learned how to knock.
In the end, Urumba did what cities and hearts must do. It learned and moved forward. Ember Thyme opened each morning like a small prayer, steam writing soft psalms on the window, while Amara, Malik, and 3 bright shadows practiced the ordinary holiness of care. Elsewhere, Kelechi kept his appointments with truth, a man who finally understood that some bridges are built from apology and time. Zara wore her piece like a well-tailored dress, no labels, perfect fit. Mama Nwoke learned to use blessings where blame used to sit, and Ifeoma, general of gentle wars, kept the drumbeat of daily rescue steady. The lesson lingered in shop mirrors and salon chatter, stitched into gossip until it turned proverb. Test before you accuse. Tell the truth before the room does. Pride is an expensive lawyer that always loses on appeal. Love is work, not theater. Dignity, once reclaimed, is a room you furnish with patience, chairs, and open windows. And when night rinsed